So I want to welcome you to this special spoken web listening practice that has been developed to be included in this year's Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival's online programming. And I'll explain for those of you who are new to these practices and for future listeners that Spokenweb is an international, interdisciplinary, collaborative research network that focuses on the development, digitization, description, presentation, and study of audiovisual materials, often found in archives, that document literary events and activities that have taken place in settler Canada since the 1950s. So all told, we are over 100 literary scholars, librarians and archivists, digital humanists, historians and oral historians, journalists, cultural theorists, media historians, podcasters, multimedia artists and literary practitioners, undergraduate, master's, doctoral and postdoctoral students and researchers engaged in thinking about and feeling literary history through sound rather than through the printed page alone. So that's what we do in a nutshell. And Spokenweb is also very proud to have Blue Met as one of its organizational partners. And each year we collaborate on the production of events that have emerged from Spokenweb network activities of the past year, and they integrate them into the festival program. So this year, one of these events, we have a few others, but the one we're doing today focuses on an activity that we've been doing on a weekly basis for several years now in Spokenweb, what we call listening practices. And this is a sort of special Blue Met event. Listening practices have taken very different forms over time in our Spokenweb network. You know, for a whole year, we spent time listening to full hour and a half long recordings of events as they took place, and sometimes interrupted them in the middle and then had conversations about what we were listening to. We experimented with transcribing while listening and then talking about what it is we had transcribed. Also sketching, drawing, doodling, doing various other things while listening, and then really thinking about the implications of those activities that we've engaged in. And most recently, the past year and a half, and certainly since the pandemic period has begun and we've been online, we've been doing more casual kinds of listening practices where we invite a guide. We don't call them a presenter really, but it's just someone who guides us to thinking about listening to some sounds that they bring to the table for us to share together. So when I said this is a crowdsourced listening practice, it's really the first time that we've sort of had an open invitation for people just to bring sounds on the fly, you know, prepare them to come with a sound, and essentially we'll go through, I guess it's the equivalent of a listening practice open mic, maybe, you know, where everyone can just sort of bring their own sounds, and we'll get to talk about them together. So I just want to say a few words about the theme and the title of this particular listening practice. So we're working from one of Blue Metropolis's themes, hope. You know, I think it was conceived as a theme in relation to basically hoping that we can gather in person together again for another festival sometime. There are a lot of things that we need to be hopeful about right now. And so we called it Listening for Hope in the Sound Archive. And there are quite a few big and interesting words, really concepts, you know, in the title of this special listening practice. A couple of those terms, listening and sound, are concepts that we've been exploring together in these listening practices and activities and events across Spokenweb for a long time now. And we're not going to offer sort of pat definitions in an hour, let alone in a few seconds. But I'll offer one approach that we've taken in the description to our upcoming international symposium. That's called Listening Sound Agency, since both of those words appear in the title of that symposium. And I'm also mentioning it because it's a good way to plug the symposium. This is open to the public, and you're welcome to join. So I'm going to put a link to the program here in the chat. You're welcome to check that out. It's going to be in May 18th to 23rd, really. And in our symposium description, we conceptualize listening and sound in terms of the power dynamics and effects of relationality of sound to an individual listener and of listening individuals to other listening individuals. And so I'm just going to quote from this. We write as our kind of, thesis statement for that conference, for that symposium: listening to sound entails scenarios of subjection and agency. In Althusserian terms, we might say that we are persistently interpolated or hailed into positions of listening subjects in society, requiring us to engage in or with the cultural assumptions and techniques that those listening positions entail. But listening may also represent a capacity for agency. In Sonic Agency, Brandon LaBelle elaborates upon this idea, stating that to listen is, quote, to perceive the ever-changing relations in which the self is always embedded. And as LaBelle goes on to explore a series of sonic figures, he outlines a complex roster of listening modalities in which listening is, he argues, inherently relational. So this idea of listening for hope in the archive captures a full range of identificatory and relational implications. One might say that the archive interpolates the researcher through the very imaginary promise that it presents of what it might contain. And one might say that the researcher is an agent creating the archive through their acts of listening to what is found there. The two other terms, archives and hope, are specific to this week's practice. But again, they're not necessarily terms that are new to us. Katherine and I, for example, have written quite a lot about archives and archiving and unarchiving, as have other Spokenweb team members. And I want to mention the work of one such team member, that of Michael O'Driscoll, in his introductory essay called Archiving, so Archiving, co-written with Edward Bishop, which was for a special issue on the archive that appeared in English Studies in Canada in 2004. And Mike opens the essay with the following anecdote of a researcher's experience in the archive. I was holding Virginia Woolf's suicide note. I felt a physical shock, like I was spinning into a vortex that collapsed the intervening decades. This note wasn't a record of an event. This was the event itself. This writing, and it was not for me. I'd walked in on something unbearably personal. It probably took less than 30 seconds to read the letter, and in that interval, I'd been blasted back to March 1941 and staggered up to the present, time roaring in my ears. My first encounter with the archival jolt. Mike's idea of the archival jolt and the emotionally charged eventfulness of archival encounter suggests an idea of archives as temporally rich and complicated entities, as really sort of teleportation devices to some extent, potentially. As he goes on, he puts it, archives are not just institutional sites, but also spatio-temporal processes. If we understand an event, he continues, to be a singular, non-repeatable, transformative moment in any given series or process, then one might indeed say that archiving is always eventual. Every act of archiving is an event. Every event that we recognize as such has been, in one form or another, archived. And when we examine events of the archive, then what we are doing is recognizing those moments of enunciation, iteration, inscription, or performance, at which the very act of archiving itself has been archived. Careful analysis of such moments of self-reflexivity, those moments when the archive turns back and announces itself, tells us much about, as Adrienne Rich says, the assumptions in which we are drenched. So our practice today, insofar as it invites participants to share sounds and reflect upon manifestations of hope in the archive, will function, I think, as an interesting, as interesting moments of such self-reflexivity. And so finally, what are we reflecting about? Right? Ultimately, it's hope, right? What is hope? It's an emotion, or a combination of different emotions with some real intent, perhaps, connected with them. So if we go with the OED definition, it's hope is the expectation of something desired. Desire combined with expectation. It's an emotion that is often paired with other antonymic emotions. So in phrases we hear hope, in hope and in silence, right? Articulation of something you want and then sort of snuffing it out, right? Hope and fear are often paired together. And as a Victorianist, I always have to look at sort of Victorian definitions of things. And Alexander Bain, who is a very early Victorian psychologist, defined it with this line. He said, "This is the emotion of hope, which is ideality coupled with belief." So it's also a form of faith, perhaps. As a verb, you could say hope is confident, it's imaginative, it's outcome oriented. You know, it's sort of like a project manager's affect. You know, we're going to get this, make this happen. There's also something, as I was sort of quickly preparing for these opening remarks, I've discovered called hope theory. It's a particular branch of modern psychology. C.R. Snyder is one of the founders of this branch, you know, and his essay called Hope Theory, published in Psychological Inquiry, defines it. He says, hope is defined as the perceived capability to derive pathways to desired goals and motivate oneself via agency thinking to use those pathways. So hope is very much like a kind of, this is part of like positive thinking, you could say, but it's sort of like ideological self-preparation to achieve something, to find something. One can also imagine the negative elements of these sort of object or outcome-oriented elements of hope, which is that it's quite, you could say it has an inclination perhaps towards performing certain kinds of violence upon the things that it's rummaging through and trying to achieve, right? Insofar as it's often very single-minded. And finally, what do we say about archival hope? And I'll just get us started on this. Hope aims to seek what it is seeking. It has expectations of what it might find, what ought to be there, based on imagined narratives of what once was, what has already happened, right? So in a sense, the archive is similar to, but also a kind of opposite manifestation of the traditional hope chest, right? You know, of the 19th century, sort of like a dowry as well, a chest in which often a young woman would collect items that would project her future life as a bride, as a mother, etc. The archive is sort of like a hope chest designed to project a future for the past, one could say. And hope in the sound archive seeks traces, sonic traces of such past events. So hope in or for an archive of the event aims, you could say, at the impossible, right? To make a past event that we associate with presence exist again in the now, in the present. It's a particular form of temporal nostalgia, maybe, wanting to be not just in two places at once. Often homesickness, for example, means I want to be here, but I also want to be there, but my body can only be in one place, and that's a problem because, you know, we exist in one corporeal manifestation. The version of nostalgia or of homesickness, you know, for archival hope is more wanting to be in two times at once. So that's what I'm going to say as opening remarks, just to sort of get us started, just to throw a bunch of things out there. And really what I want to do now is create the roster of archival hope sounders. So I think Katherine already, I know, has prepared some sounds. And I also have something to share if there's time, but I'm wondering if anyone else present would be interested in sharing a sound today.
So we've actually sort of made a open mic list through the chat.
Oh,
So I think
cool.
we've got it. We've got it set. It looks like
So Katherine,
I'm just gonna, yeah, I'm gonna share something to start with, and then on our open mic set, Jason, you can maybe decide where you want to go in this. So we've got Faith Pare, Emma Tolero, Diana Fong, Mathieu Aubin, and then Jason, we can put you either wherever it feels right to bring your sound and visuals into it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll just wait and see if there's time for me to, and I'm
Yeah.
fine not presenting anything as well. Um, although I do have a fun clip to share if
Yeah,
there is time.
even if it
Um,
ends up being the last the part, the hope to leave us to leave us off of this. So
Good.
that's
So just a few, yeah. So you've discovered the chat. Please use it whenever you like. Um, have you given everyone co-hosting privileges who will be sharing sound, Catherine?
not yet. That's the next
Okay,
step to
so
do
we'll
so.
be doing that. So we'll invite you to share your own sounds. And if you need help doing that, if you've not done it before, if you're only sharing a sound clip and don't want to share a screen, then you can go to the advanced setting and click on computer audio, and that will allow you to play your sound through Zoom. So we'll all be able to hear it really well, but without blocking our view of each other with the shared screen. But if you are sharing a screen, then you'll see how to do that, but you'll have to make sure to click the little share sound button in the bottom left corner for us to be able to hear the sound. So that's my technical tip for the day. And without further ado, I'm going to unpin myself and I'm going to allow Catherine to take things over.
There's a little cut in the internet, but yeah, so thank you for that introduction, especially to leave us off with that thought about archival hope and what we're trying to do. We're trying to be in two places at once. So my thinking about hope in the archives really relates to time and temporality. And I have to play a clip that I created for the Shortcut series. That's a series that's a monthly feature on the Spokenweb podcast, where I do a deep dive into the Spokenweb audio collections and cut a sound and place it in the context of either some commentary or some conversation. So it just so happened that in January of this year, I created a Shortcuts episode called Audible Time. And that episode revolves around the question of how we hear time in the archives. And it occurred to me that these moments when a future reading is announced, really you have this sense that something is coming up, something is going to, we have things to look forward to. So I'm going to let the clip speak for itself, and but just to say a couple of things before I play it, and this is one. I'm just going to switch screens here for a moment. That in what we're about to hear, I'd like you to think about how we're hearing what it feels like to look forward to something. And I phrase that for many reasons, that we're hearing a feeling, we're hearing that feeling of hope. But I thought a lot about whether in hearing hope, are we are we then hearing the future, or are we hearing this hope and this desire, this expectation for something in the future? What are we hearing when we're hearing that hope? But also then, what does it feel like to hear something, hear a moment when there's a looking forward to something, and then how do we sort of we're trying to both put ourselves in the position of the listener in the moment, in the room, in the space, listening to that and looking forward to something in the future, but we're also then listening to that as archival listeners, and really aware that that future, in this case it was 1968, so the future has definitely happened and we are way farther ahead in the future, and so we're listening to a moment in the past in which there was this anticipation of the future. So we could listen to so many different moments that have this in there. There's a collection through Spokenweb that's called the Radio Free Rainforest Collection. And in that, it was a radio program out in Vancouver. And at the end, sometimes they would actually announce upcoming poetry readings. Or we could listen to other, ends of readings where they say the next reading will be this and this. But I thought that this one, because it's the end of the year, you're not only just looking forward to the reading that's coming up, but also what might happen in the year that follows. So this is my clip of hope in the archives. You will hear me also talk about it, so that's why I'm going to keep my remarks short. I think it speaks for itself, and I'm interested if we, after hearing it, maybe just to take a couple minutes to reflect on it as a group and talk about it before then moving on to our next archival clip in the open mic. So I am going to share. So this is from the shortcut series that's on the Spoken Web podcast. This was the December episode of 2020. How can you hear time? When listening to a recording, can you be listening for time? In a set of recordings of a reading series, such as the Sir George Williams Poetry Series, there's an audible marking of time whenever a host of a December reading mentions that the next reading will take place in January. The new year. What hopes did the audience have for the new year? How do these archival recordings help us understand hope in our present moment?
I negotiate the steps of paradise, leaping to measures that I cannot hear. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Hine and also announce that the next reading is on January 26 by the American poet John Logan.
That was a clip of the end of Daryl Hine reading The Trout in December 1967. What was the audience thinking, and what did they imagine for January 1968? We hear that anticipation in my last example, the end of a reading by Charles Simic in 1971.
Greatest mistake. The word I allowed to be written when I should have shouted her name. Thank you. The next reading will be on January 14th. Dorothy Livesey will read at that time.
If I were in the audience in 1971, I would be looking forward to that reading by Dorothy Livesey in 1972. Listening for time in the archives reveals moments such as these, ones in which hope is audible. That listening is something we can learn from as we anticipate a new year. We don't know what is ahead. And even as I speak these words now, recording them under my blanket fort at home, I hope they will be heard, though in what context I do not know. Right now, I play the role of the host in these archival recordings by marking time here and now, and by imagining a future time. In the role of the archival listener, I also know how it feels to hear a future time imagined as hopeful. It's a powerful feeling to look forward to something, to share that feeling, and to listen back, hearing people looking forward to something. Thanks for listening, and here's to more listening together in 2021. All right, so as the archival host of that clip, what was it like to hear that? And there were some comments in the chat already about where you heard hope in that. And I'm interested if anyone would be open to sharing that with us out loud. I noticed that there was a comment from Deanna Fong about the feeling of nostalgia and hearing audience applause. Mattia noticed the announcement for future readers evokes a sense of hope. And also, Kristen made the note that, that sometimes listening to podcasts, even in when you hear something from 2019, knowing that 2020 is coming, you kind of now listening back, we realize what was to come with the pandemic, and just everything that it was, everything that encompassed 2020, and that hearing something from 2019 can have, there's a lot of emotion attached to it. I was also interested too, partly in why I selected this in the beginning was that when thinking about when the difference between the phrase looking forward to something versus, say, listening forward to something, that to what extent in listening are we always in the present? We're always in the listening. And when I thought about, okay, well, what does it mean then to listen to a group of people who would technically say that they are looking forward to something? I just thought that it was a really interesting, what it revealed about looking and listening and where those two sensory modes place us temporally. So that was another sort of intentional choice to think about what it sounds like to listen to people looking forward to something there at the end. So maybe even we can keep all this, maybe these will be sort of thoughts to keep in mind as we proceed. And I think that the clips that are to come actually kind of like provide even more material for us to reflect upon some of these opening questions. So why don't we keep all these questions coming in the
Deanna,
chat?
do you want to talk? Deanna's hand is
yeah.
up. So.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I realized that I've just had a sort of coincidence with what Faith has posted in the chat, but something that really stood out to me is it's really one of those archival instances of times touching when you talk about looking forward to listening with you in 2021, so that this moment right now is the fulfillment of that call issued, however many months ago, 4 months ago, so that I'm thinking here of Rebecca Schneider's work on reperformance and the ways that in every instance of archiving and creating a document that it creates a script for this kind of future engagement with it. And every time we listen or every time we engage with those artifacts, we're fulfilling something that's ingrained in the moment of recording itself. So I actually felt that in a really palpable way at the end of your recording.
Yeah, and there's always the choice too to decide, and I made a very conscious choice to decide I'm going to say looking forward to 2021, because you can also decide to try to make your piece as timeless as possible and not mention any current events and not locate it in time. But in doing that, then it does sort of say whoever's listening to this, you will hear this, but I don't know in what context that will be. What kind of reenactment, to think of Schneider, will take place with this, but there might be something that future. Yeah, Jason, do you want to?
Yeah, I would like to ask Kristen to elaborate a little bit on that particular feeling, right? Because I find I'm feeling that listening to anything that suggests, first of all, just hearing people together, right? So that's an obvious one, but also just thinking about people in 67, there's so much awful stuff to come, and so just hearing anything that historical, I think within the current year just makes me more and more sort of sad and anxious and somehow not hopeful, the opposite in a way, that, oh, you don't know what's coming. There's so many bad things coming. So you may sound hopeful, but from our perspective, we know that you're being naive, not hopeful, or something like that. So I just was wondering if Kristen's sort of feeling about even hearing things from last year, and having sort of similar sorts of feelings, if she wants to say more about that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, I was thinking specifically of, I listened to a number of podcasts that are either sort of kind of comedy trivia podcasts or readings of different things where it's a group of people who in normal times sort of get together in a location and record together. And in both of the podcasts I'm thinking of, the group of them also do live shows where they travel to different theaters or bars in their respective countries and do these performances. And both of these shows kept recording in 2020, but it's obviously they're recording over Zoom, and any live shows they've done have been virtual. So it's very strange to even just listen to these very generally quite upbeat, kind of distracting shows from a year ago, where the hosts will be talking, oh, our live show next year, or we're hoping to get our tour schedule out soon, and kind of the same sort of feeling of the host in the recordings from 67 of oh yeah, at some point in the future we'll meet again, and then knowing in retrospect that that couldn't happen. It's just sort of a weird feeling. And it's, yeah, kind of like Katherine was saying, it sort of draws attention to the time in which these recordings were created, in a way that mention of the year or mention of a specific date might risk feeling kind of timeless. If you didn't know, oh, in this episode, they're recording in the same room versus virtually. Yeah, so that's what I was thinking about there.
Thanks. Yeah, that's makes a lot of sense. It's a strange thing to hear retrospectively articulations of an idea of something that's going to happen, right? And sometimes, especially in the case that you're raising, where it's not, now we know it's not going to happen, right? So it really does, I think it really grounds us in our positionality temporally, in relation to our knowledge or lack of knowledge about events, depending on where we are on the timeline, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And also the point that's come out right from the start is that like hope and despair are always so bound in each other, and that even the question too about both hope and despair, but also the future and the past, like the hope, it seems like it is tied to a kind of nostalgia, or is like Emma's raised a question in the chat about hope or anticipation here necessarily bound up with nostalgia, as in I'm anticipating an event that has passed and cannot attend, as time is malleable. And really, I think when thinking, it's one thing to think of how the hope was functioning in the room, but how does nostalgia get bound up in our listening to hope as archival listeners? So it does seem to be playing a role there. Also a great comment, earlier, yes, Faith's comment, that then Diana was commenting on how it really resonated with her point about the remarks about literature as being that the listener, reader attendee, that hope is really based on an anticipation felt by those subjects. And then Clara's sort of articulating a difficult, either maybe a difficult point around hope and a sense of not wanting to necessarily trust in the future. And I think maybe we can come back to all of these points in the next clip. So we're gonna have more than enough to talk about here, but let's move on to our next open mic sound, which I think we will go to, back to my list here.
Faith, right?
I have Faith. Yeah, I had Faith here.
So this technically isn't part of the Spokenweb archives, but because I've been thinking a lot in my research with Spokenweb about traditions of Black performance poetry and plays with sound via poetics. Katherine and Jason were very open for me to bring in this kind of external clip that I remembered and went, oh, this might be great for the listening practice. This is I'll play only 30 seconds of this really great track, and I'll link it in case anyone wants to listen to it in its entirety. But this is the titular track from the album Cheerful and Optimistic by Jane Cortez, who was an African-American poet and spoken word performer. And this is with her band, the Fire Spitters, who she worked with this evolving group for about 20 years, I think, plus. I'm just trying to think of what else to say. Maybe I'll leave most of my comments for afterward and see if anyone has some initial reactions at the moment. But I think this is a really great piece that portrays the how excellent it can be to, maneuver out of traditional ideas of what hope should sound like and manifest as, and how there are different kinds of like how pessimism can be a vehicle, I guess, for hope, how there are different modes of, I think, imagining what a world can be like and critiquing the world that we're in, I suppose. So those were our initial thoughts, and I'll add some more.
Be cheerful, be optimistic. Like me, I'm cheerful and optimistic, even though the automatic teller machines are telling me I have no doubt. I I'm cheerful and optimistic, even though the greenhouse effects are making me blue. I'm cheerful and optimistic, even though the earth is quaking and the ice age is on my doorstep. I'm cheerful and optimistic. I'm so cheerful, so optimistic. I'm so cheerful, so optimistic.
I'll end it there because I want to make sure we can get to other people's points. But maybe my initial thoughts are, and just that little clip, I think there's such an interesting play between the way that Cortez is like parodying a kind of, I think, almost hallmark attitude, a kind of capitalist, almost commercialized way of speaking about hope, which is really funny, and how she's only really doing it with very little text itself, but really in using her voice as an instrument, and how she's playing with the instrumentalists and like really capturing that like cheery attitude that becomes, once you hear what she's saying, is deeply concerning, that you almost have that kind of nervous laughter that accompanies it. Oh, I see the chat is already blowing up, which is great. Yeah, Nicole echoes and says, love Cortez and all she does with her voice in that clip, very commercialized and sarcastic. And yeah, I love how sarcasm is really leveraged, and so, you know, it's so few words, and how she uses the even though, I guess, as throughout the poem is really her hinge in thinking about the ways that often we quantify our experiences of hope and despair. Deanna Fong mentioned earlier that they're both types of longing, and Emma added afterward, and loss, dealings with loss. And it's interesting how in that kind of longing we quantify, you know, things are going, you know, poorly right now. I lost my job, or, you know, the weather's been bad, but I have hope that things will pick up. So how do we like navigate this kind of, or kind of quantifying or dealing with their own despair, I suppose. Deanna also adds that it's sarcastic, but maybe also hiding a grain of sincerity as well. Emma adds, yes, secret idealism, perhaps. Yeah, and I'm really interested in that too. Particularly around a kind of, I think she's playing with a very interesting kind of Black feminist ethos of being like, I'm done with this particular kind of world and holding on to what this world should be, and being invested in a hope in what this world currently is, and what can we instead, can we like toss what this is out for something else, essentially. So there's, and also, are we perhaps being too critical? Maybe there is an element of like, what if we did read this as completely sincere? I think human beings also have a kind of skepticism, or, you know, or perturbed by what we read as completely sincere, which is interesting. I don't think she is. I think she's playing, of course, with what sincerity is doing in this piece, but it is interesting as a kind of test of how uncomfortable we feel about sincerity, but also how uncomfortable we feel about complaint. And Kristen adds as well, made me think a lot about critiques of forced positivity. And there was also, you know, Jason's comment earlier about, you know, hope as a psychological investigation. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, you just got me thinking, because I love the way that the chat analysis went from, yes, she's being totally sarcastic and this is a great critique, to, well, maybe there is underlying sincerity to this. And the music, of course, which we can't ignore, is also a very sort of uplifting, you know, kind of music. But it got me thinking about how in many ways, like listening to really sad songs is sort of much more, I guess, hope oriented perhaps than listening to really sort of happy, cheery, you know, Barney type songs, you know, like, and so it just got me thinking about the degree to which the sarcasm actually is a holder of hope as compared to if it were completely sincere. In a way, it's the skeptic, it's the critic, it's the person who's not satisfied that is presenting that idealism that we associate with a greater, more hopeful future. And so the sarcasm perhaps is carrying, you know, kinds of hope that sincerity couldn't, you know.
Yeah, I think Deanna really bookmarked your point well too, and adding, I think it invites us to hold sarcasm and sincerity together without reconciling them, which makes a lot of sense. That often
Totally.
when like psychologists talk about like emotions like grief too, that there's a very particular kind of performance of grief that we have socially that doesn't actually necessarily reflect the complexity of like human emotion in dealing with grief. And I think what's really cool about this clip that I'll make sure I send to all of you as well is that even in the 1990s, this poem is really grounded in talking about climate disaster. She mentions at other points, and you heard about the greenhouse gases and the ice age being on the doorstep, but she also talks about, even though I'm eating polluted fish tonight, and, she's also eating Exxon king crab legs, like dipped in oil from Alaska or something. There's a real particular sense of like an impending doom around the climate about 20 years earlier than like a larger, I guess, bang around it that we're going through now. So I'm really interested in how she is she's navigating grief and sincerity and like trying to take a chance on hope, but also kind of recoiling from it at the same time. It's a really complex clip, and the song is only 3 minutes and 17 seconds. It's really something. So thanks for letting me share today, and I appreciate all your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faith. That was just the most fantastic clip. So I'm so happy that you shared that with us. Next up on the open mic, we have Emma Tolero, and I've got your clip ready, Emma. So I'm just going to pin you now as a speaker, and you can say what you wish to introduce the clip or to let it play. But yeah.
I'll be super quick. So my clip is also not from the Spokenweb archive. It's something I came across in my own research. So I'm working on Diane de Prima for my master's research project, and I led a listening practice about a month ago on her revolutionary letters. And so I wanted to share revolutionary letter number 49. So it's a short clip from the beginning of the reading, which is actually available on UbuWeb. So it was a recording done for the Dial-Up Poem series in 1969, I believe. And I think it's a great segue from Faith's clip from Cortez, because I think this clip also sort of deals with questions of hope in relation to transformation and in relation to social transformation. And I'm really interested in that in terms of like also the rage that comes through, or how rage propels this sort of use of hope through poetry. Yeah, so that's it.
That's great. So I've got it set here, and you said 3 minutes and 25 seconds in. I'm gonna press play there.
Perfect.
This is revolutionary letter number 49. Free Julian Beck. Free Timothy Leary. Free 7 million starving in Pakistan. Free all political prisoners. Free Angela Davis. Free Soledad Brothers. Free Martin Sobel. Free Sacco Bill Hayward. Free Sitting Bull. Free Crazy Horse. Free all political prisoners. Free Billy the Kid. Free Jesse James. Free all political prisoners. Free Nathan Hale. Free Joan of Arc. Free Galileo and Bruno and Eckhart. Free Jesus Christ. Free Socrates prisoners. Free all prisoners are political prisoners. Every pot smoker a political prisoner. Every hold-up man a political prisoner. Every forger a political prisoner. Every angry kid who smashed a window a political prisoner. Every whore, pimp, murderer a political prisoner. Every pederast, dealer, drunk driver, burglar, poacher, striker, strikebreaker, rapist. Polar bear at San Francisco Zoo, political prisoner. Ancient wise turtle at Detroit Aquarium, political prisoner. Flamingos dying in Phoenix Tourist Park, political prisoners. Otters in Tucson Desert Museum, political prisoners. Elk in Wyoming grazing behind barbed wire, political prisoners. Prairie dogs poisoned in New Mexico, war casualties. Mass grave of Wyoming bald eagles, a battlefield. Every kid in school, a political prisoner. Every lawyer in his cubicle, a political prisoner. Every doctor brainwashed by AMA, a political prisoner. Every housewife, a political prisoner. Every teacher lying through sad teeth, a political prisoner. Every Indian on reservation, a political prisoner. Every black man, a political prisoner. Every faggot hiding in bar, a political prisoner. Every junkie shooting up in John, a political prisoner. Every woman, a political prisoner. Every woman, a political prisoner. You are political prisoner locked in tense body. You are political prisoner locked in stiff mind. You are political prisoner locked to your parents. You are political prisoner locked to your past. Free yourself. Free yourself. I am political prisoner locked in anger habit. I am political prisoner locked in greed habit. I am political prisoner locked in fear habit. I am political prisoner locked in dull senses. I am political prisoner locked in numb flesh. Free me, free me, help to free me. Free yourself, help to free me. Free yourself, help to free me. Free Barry Goldwater, help to free me. Free Governor Wallace, free President Nixon, free J. Edgar Hoover. Free them, free yourself. Free them, free yourself. Free yourself, free them. Free yourself, help to free me. Free us, dance.
Thanks for playing the whole thing. It's hard to stop it once it gets going.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it back into the sounds that we're listening to. Thank you so much.
I don't have much to say. I haven't really prepared anything, but there's some great comments in the chat.
Yeah, let's even hearing how it speaks and resonates with the previous clips too. Let's take a look at some of these comments here.
Yeah, I really like this idea of Deanna, the motivation as a necessity. So this sort of the need that is like inherent in hope. And I hear that so much in this recording, the sort of the uncompromising demands of DePrima's like rhetorical gestures and the way that she's also just like asking for a certain kind of complicity with her listener. Like, I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, do you want to speak to that point, Deanna, that comparison?
Sure. It was beautiful to hear both the Jane Cortez and Diane DePrima, and thinking, I was wondering about the importance of hope for bringing us together for necessity, for shared interests. And I think that Jane Cortez spoke to it in a more playful way, and then there was the power of Diane DePrima's reading and performance. So I think, yeah, that it could be it could be perceived as a more loaded and important tool for coming together, whether historically, we can observe that historically, but also in the current moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm wondering too that, Nicole, your comment here about hope as action, I'm wondering if you'd like to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I thought your recording and then the one we just heard, I just kept thinking about the ways in which hope gets called on particularly in discourses. If we think about like a W.E.B. Du Bois historically, and then currently a Cornel West or a Barack Obama, the idea that hope is, it's a feeling, but it's also this belief or this call to action that insists that there can be a different reality.
In the present, in that listening, how does one then make that listening act? How does it become active? And maybe like action is a great way to think of conversation happening in the chat, whether Faith, Deanna Fong, Clara would like to speak to some of the issues being raised in the chat. I don't want to summarize them, but if anyone would like to jump in here, maybe Faith or.
Yeah, maybe I
or
can
Janet,
just
yeah.
very quickly say I was really resonating strongly with Clara and Deanna Fong's points, where there's this interesting play with a kind of endlessness of like cruelty, essentially. But then there's always a kind of resistant effort that accompanies it, essentially. That it's always a kind of tit for tat in terms of like the carceral aims of the state. That's not just limited to who we identify as political prisoners, but everyone, like she says, is a political prisoner. But it always means that there's someone who is speaking on behalf of that person. So I love that, the double play there, to attempt to try and that doesn't give justice to, I think, Deanna's and Clara's really excellent points. But Clara said something like, oh, I see a thumbs up. I love this framing of a hopelessly expansive, like Clara said, and then Deanna said really excellently, that some of the positions in here that are difficult for the mind to incorporate, but the exhaustiveness of it seems to be suggesting that there's no opting out from structural change. And I love how those tensions are playing and competing with each other throughout the poem.
Also thinking of repetition, that Mathieu made a point about the shift from prisoner into freedom. And it also then made me think of a very earlier point that Deanna Fong made about, is there some other way to talk about exhaustion and deja vu in the archives? And that just made me think of Mathieu's point, because it can feel like sometimes we're coming back to the same things over and over again. And so, what does it mean that we're there, that whatever was being hoped for might not have materialized? And so those are both very important points for thinking through what it really, again, what it means to be doing this kind of archival listening through a lens of hope, and how maybe it also asks us to rethink, both our effective relations to them, but also that what can be made out of it. With that, maybe we go to our next up on the open mic, and we can cycle back to all of these points here. Also, we're going to end up going over time, so if you end up having to fade out of the meeting, that's very fine. I think we'll continue on for actually quite a while, at least another half an hour. So thank you, Clara, for joining us. Next up on the open mic, I'm going to have to consult my list back up here, but I think it's Deanna Fong. So yeah, it is Deanna Fong. And maybe Jason, if you could make Deanna a host to share the audio. And Deanna, thank you for bringing us a sound of hope, or a sound that relates to hope in some sort of way.
Thanks. And I just wanted to say that what I really love about the recordings that we've heard so far today is that they're really asking us to hold all these kind of contradictory ideas or affects together in our hearts, which to me, I guess is kind of an essential quality of hope, because it's fraught with so much like ambiguity and ambivalence and uncertainty, that it's never sort of doesn't exist without sort of the inflection of its obverse too. So, however, I think my clip is probably going to be like a little bit more, straightforwardly hopeful. But to give a little bit of context, this is a clip from the Roy Kiyuka Audio Archive, which is a part of the Spokenweb collections, though it's not been processed yet, so it's not up on the website. It exists in physical form at the Simon Fraser University Special Collections, and in digital form on my external hard drive. I think that's the only place so far. But this is a recording from June 26, 1982. The first 15 minutes of this tape are rainfall, and the last 10 or so minutes are Roy Kiyuka in conversation with artist Trudy Rubenfeld. And I'll just share my screen here. I had it clipped down to 30 seconds, but I think I might kick it back like a tiny bit because it's great to hear the context as well. So the event in question here is that Roy makes Trudy a cup of coffee for the first time. Okay, here we go.
It's instant.
Here?
I'm ready for it.
Hey, I think this is the first time I've ever made coffee for you. You've made coffee for me hundreds of times.
That's right, Roy.
See, things are changing.
Yeah.
Things are changing.
Oh, they are. It is a time of change.
In every sense.
It is.
I see it all over the place, in everybody's lives.
Isn't it incredible?
Oh, it's devastating. It makes me tremble
Oh, it's
sometimes.
wonderful.
Yeah, sure it
I
is.
mean, but it is trembling.
Yes. Oh, yes. Because the shape of whatever those changes are about is not a given. It's a working out. It's,
Well, that's what's exciting.
yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Because there was so much given when all these years. There was so much holding patterns.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop it there. So in case anybody doesn't know, Roy Kyoka is or was a Japanese-Canadian painter, poet, avid recordist. He recorded almost continually for a span of 30 years. So he has a huge archive of these sort of candid, conversational, everyday sounds in his archive. So why I wanted to share this clip, like a quotation comes to mind, which is, there's a micro-politics of perception, affection, and conversation. A quote from Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, which I normally would not quote from because I'm a staunch Lacanian, but I think it seems to fit the occasion of hope, you know. So even a pessimistic Deleuzian is a secret optimist. But that, you know, there are all of these little micro encounters that create these fluctuations. And I like the idea of this like fluctuation as resonating with the trembling that Roy brings up, that there's this kind of like very small vibration in the air. And, you know, Brian Masumi talks about affect, especially as affect, you know, plays out between subjects, that the more we increase our sort of capabilities for affective response, the more sort of experimental possibilities or ways forward we have in our lives. So that in this kind of like micro-political affective fabric, that there is a kind of hope, I guess, or possibility for change on a micro level, which is something that really appeals to me. And what else was I going to say? I think that's probably all I have to say about that for the moment. But yeah, so slightly, I think, different kind of recording, different kind of take on hope. But
it was so perfect, I feel like, especially in this moment of our listening practice, because it was also a clip that I think let us just really listen in a very in a way that we are listening to different things, like maybe in even if we think of kind of the momentum of some of the recordings that we've listened to so far, they had a lot of momentum and a push and action, and here there was talking about change, but the recording itself, just we felt like we were just like settling into the sounds, and whether it was the sounds of the coffee or just the gasps and the sighs in between. And I wrote down actually how Trudy said, "Oh, they are," and it just felt like that. Just that it was like deep breaths throughout. So it felt like I liked how it also gave us a different sound of whether sound of hope or sound of people talking about hope and change. It just sounded different than the other clips, which I think was also really interesting to think of why. And there's lots coming in on the chat on why that is. So if anyone from those comments wants to jump in, I'm going to take a moment to read through the chat.
Yeah, I do love the pace at which this is delivered. And I think very, very rare in the archive that there's this kind of, you know, like the sort of slowness of conversation between friends, and definitely no need to, like they don't feel the need to like rush forward to fill empty space. It's nice to have that just,
Yeah.
that expansiveness to it.
And also something that came up in the chat, going back to even Kristen's point of, Kristen says, so everyone is always looking forward to something and looking backwards to the other things, no matter how large or small. And actually it was the large or small in terms of scale that made me think of in this clip, we have the scale of making coffee and then talking about big changes in the world, massive changes. So it's really, we hear both of those things. Also, Jason and Faith have some great comments in here. If either of you want to read those out loud. Also, Mathieu and Ben, anyone want to expand on their comment, or even just it's always great to hear the comment read out loud in your voice. So maybe Mathieu, do you want to speak to what you were writing about there?
Yeah, so it's out of fear of reading too much, because I only have a snippet of the clip. But I was thinking, you know, like the gender relations and the gender dynamic of like, she is always the one making the cups of coffee. And there's that like care work that people were referring to earlier in the chat. And I'm like, and then finally he's making the coffee. It's almost like the one day where like somebody else is doing the dishes or doing the cooking or doing something. It's like, there's hope in the air, literally in the space where this is maybe the first of many cups to come from Roy. But I only hear the clip, so that's, I was thinking maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that's kind of where my brain went to. It's like, he's like, oh, I'm trembling. I have to make the cup of coffee, I guess. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it's a minute thing, but it might also be like an extremely momentous thing. And just to provide a little bit of context, like I think it is to a certain extent a gender thing, but also Trudy was Roy's student for a long time. So they have that sort of dynamic to their relationship as well, as that's how they start off. And then this is a sort of like moving into their relationship being as more like contemporaries and friends.
It is momentous, I think. Sorry, I will jump in on Catherine's invitation because it's a first, right? So, but it's a first within the scale of everyday actions. Yeah, so my comments are really sort of about the Cuke archive in a broader sense too, that it, like these recordings are, it's so many hours, right, of this kind of stuff. And just wondering sort of what that represents in relation to sort of one's position to time and the passing of time, right? You know, so like it's sort of in one sense a hopeful position to take on the tiny little events of life, right? And so it's sort of an acknowledgement that, oh, this is so wonderful, that's so wonderful, like I want to smell every flower, right? And so I'm going to record everything that happens in the world because it's all worth capturing, right? Insofar as capturing is a gesture of love to those things, right? But the person who walks around with a tape recorder taping time all the time, you know, can also be seen as someone who's just, you know, in constant dread of loss, right? Because we have to preserve this. It's going away. Oh, it just went away again. It just went away again, right? You know, so it sort of has both sides to it. I don't know. You've spent more time in Cuke's archive than probably anyone. Yeah, I wonder if you have if you lean one way or the other on sort of what that archive actually means. Yeah.
Oh, this is something I bang my head against all the time, like the reason why he felt it so important to record these things. And I know like part of it is that he imagined it as a sort of substance for, you know, incorporating into his own art, his own artwork. And so like he's got a great quotation that every event is its own archive. It doesn't have to go through an artifice to become something. So that there's like a simultaneity of the event itself and the document it produces, which I think actually in terms of like the weird temporality of hopefulness is quite compelling. But yeah, it seems, I don't have an answer for why why he wanted to record so much. And I think like part of it has to do with, I do really think that it's a kind of anti-capitalist and anti-commercialist kind of artistic gesture that, you know, like the antidote for the sort of isolation and alienation of capital is to record these like I say, micro-political kind of encounters with each other. And that's where we can find a source of resistance, even if it's on a really minute scale.
So then it is a hopeful archive, I suppose, if that's what it consists of, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
still agnostic though.
Also perhaps hopeful in the sense of Ali, Emma, and Faith were connecting on in the chat about sort of the ways in which an archive like this can just document sort of the everyday, but then ends up documenting care work, and it ends up documenting the smaller gestures that actually have great weight to them, and so then that becomes recorded, and that in and itself is hopeful in its own way, not in a overly optimistic sense, but more in the sense that it is documenting that labor and that work. Also, Ben, you had a couple thoughts on this one. I was wondering if you wanted to jump in vocally on your response to this clip.
I think folks have already kind of outlined what I was thinking towards or pointing at, but I think it's a generous gesture on behalf of the recordist and the archive to sort of instructionally show the way that these sort of small interventions and patterns of behavior can then scale outwards into the larger patterns of resistance, where oftentimes looking at sort of material that something like DePrima's recording is talking about, or the other recordings dealing with climate change, standing before problems that expensive can be very immobilizing and alienating. So to find your first step in just making your first cup of coffee for someone you care for, and then scale it out, I think that's sort of a very primal grain of hope in a very sincere and deep felt way, for me at least.
I agree. And I think with that, maybe we go to our last sound on the open mic, possibly one encore sound from Jason, but we might have our last sound from Mathieu, if you are still up for sharing. I know we've gone over time, but this is fantastic. So let's, we'll make you co-host as you introduce your sound.
Yeah. So if people have to leave halfway through, even at the beginning, it's plenty fine. So originally I was going to share a very specific sound from a podcast episode that I produced with Felicity Taylor and Scott Giroir. And originally the piece was going to be like this. So to give you the sense of like the episode is about lesbian liberation media and thinking and listening about media from the 70s, 80s, and more contemporary. And at first, when I was trying to grapple, what am I going to talk about if I want to contribute something to this? I was thinking about a specific moment that I had in a dialogue with Felicity at the very end, where we were reflecting about the process of, starting this as a listening practice over a year ago now, and then making that into an actual event where many people from lesbian community were invited and participating. We were watching these films in full, and sparked a huge conversation. And then me suggesting to her, how about let's try, and thinking about the hope now, like let's try to put a podcast episode together. It's probably going to sound a little different from what we've been hearing the Spokenweb podcast, but let's give it a try. So we produced the collage, and at the very end, we do an interview with each other. And something that we realized is that rallied us is our friendship, and that she says is grounded in queer affinity. And that for me speaks volumes about hope, about like working with her since 2016. And that sense of like, that's what carries me through this pandemic right now, is the work that I do with Felicity or with you, Katherine, or Deanna, like on a regular basis. But I'm going to take a slightly more potential generative moment of the episode that I think doesn't actually necessarily talk about hope, but talks about a mixture of like, what do we do when we listen to these difficult moments in the archive? And how do we actually think about the future, maybe shape that a little bit differently? Because I think of Kate Eichhorn's thing about like returning the queer archives and thinking, how do we actually change the present if we can? And so this is I'm going to share with you, sharing screen, a quick 1-minute passage from the episode when Michelle Schwartz responds to hearing something in a press gang documentary. So here we go. Oh, just need to give you my sound too. Share sound. There we go.
I wanted to say how odd it was to watch that press gang film and then hear people sort of restating debates that we hear so much now in like in the movement. You know, like that woman who is ranting about how she doesn't know what's politically correct, and so she doesn't know whether what she can say, because now everything she says is wrong, and so she's not going to say anything. And it's just so frustrating to hear the same things sort of eternally return within sort of these kinds of communities. And it was just really fascinating to hear that particular kind of iteration of political correctness sort of from so far in the past. And I just I always wonder whether we're just like doomed to have the same fights forever.
And that's the question that keeps haunting me in a good way, is are we doomed to repeating these fights forever? Like, are we or can we be hopeful about shifting things? What kind of intergenerational or relational dialogue can produce, right? So I love this as an example of like somebody literally more from my age, my generation, my age group, who is listening to an older clip and being like, yes, these issues are still surfacing. And so, but within a space that's very public and opening up room for dialogue about, are we doomed? Are we not doomed? So that's what I want to share with you. It's kind of hopeful, but it's kind of also not.
I'm so glad you chose this, and also that we did place this at the end, because to leave it with, the question of are we doomed? I think in many ways it comes back to some of the comments in the chat that have been coming throughout. Deanna Fong made the point about what do we do with this exhaustion and this sense of deja vu, that are we just repeating the same things? And I think even it also then ties to the ways in which we either heard clips as kind of like a call for action, and then if so, what happened? And then because we're in listening to Hope in the archives, we are hearing the moments before the action, or we're hearing the moments that are wanting something to happen, and that thing isn't necessarily recorded. We're hearing the before moments. At the same time, in Deanna's clip, we heard talking about changes that are happening. So that was kind of like a moment where it was reflecting upon a sort of hopefulness around actual action that has taken place. I also think if maybe this clip in many ways ties back to Jason's discussion of listening at the beginning, and the idea of having any kind of agency as a listener, and just how we think about what we do as listeners, how listening and sound can make change happen. Because I think that in many of these clips we've been hearing this like call for change, and then what comes afterwards. If there are thoughts from the conversation, Faith has made a point in the chat. Also, Jason's hand is up, so let's have a little bit of a reflection on this. Also, Magdalena has a comment in the chat too. So, Jason, do you want to start us off, and then we can go to maybe Faith and Magdalena, just to try to grapple with this big question.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe we can go Magdalena, Faith, and then me. If
Yeah,
there's
perfect.
still anything left to say.
I was just thinking that about this, that we have the impression sometimes that the fights are the same, or we are fighting for the same things. But I'm also thinking that we are also able to take like hope from the previous generations. So it's something that can nourish us. It's like this kind of renewable resource. So this is something which is hopeful in this unhopefulness of things not progressing maybe as we would always like them to.
Yeah. Faith?
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that really beautiful point that Magdalene just made, that reminds me of prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba has a quote where she says, hope is a discipline. And to think about Mathieu's question in relation to like a recording like the De Prima recording that Emma shared, it's interesting to think about, you know, the lengths of time, I suppose, that are involved in movement work like this, and how something so long can also be simultaneously so short and like a blip of a moment, I guess, in our grand story of like humanness, I suppose. So I like to try and tap into hope there by being like, I hope that there is lots of potential moving forward too, in terms of like a human story, that this is just what it is, a blip of a moment that has a lot of potential pathways to go down.
Yeah, and very well said. And also the way too that just I think that those potential pathways also remind me back to, or remind me of Deanna's comment about kind of the many micro encounters, and just the multiplicity within that hope. That hope isn't just one thing; there's this multiplicity within it. Kristen, I know we're going to go to Jason, but Kristen, do you want to even share what you wrote out loud? Because that's a really fantastic perspective to bring in.
Yeah, so I was teaching music and gender at Carleton online this past fall, and I just noticed, especially with some of the readings on feminist and queer history, kind of going, you know, further back than definitely my students or my lifetimes, I noticed that there was, yeah, this sense of both how have we always been fighting about the same things, and also like where is the agency at different points in history. And it sort of happened like between us as a group reading some of these historical authors or listening to different musical recordings, but then also like I'm roughly a decade older than most of my students, so like our sense of how these things have been talked about more recently was slightly different. And then the class was being offered as a sort of blended class, so even just the people who experienced the lecture and discussion live versus watching the recording the next day, like also had a different sense of like how these conversations were taking place. So there was just so much going on with like how we all were coming to some of these materials, and I think what we took from them.
Yeah, and that we're literally we're in different places, connecting, let alone connecting temporally and across historical periods. Thank you so much, Deanna Fong. If you are heading out, just saw your chat there. Yeah, and also thinking, Kristen, around the perspective of teaching music and gender, thinking what we've been talking about with listening and sound, and just how sonically, how so many of these points would be coming through. Thank you. Jason, how about offering a few last words, but also could we hear your clip from the archives, or see what you brought today to end things off?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just say in relation to the clip that Mathieu played, it is taken, and it's the constraint that we gave everyone, like this little moment in a much longer conversation, right? So, and I think, I can't remember who it is in the chat that mentioned sort of, yeah, Deanna mentioned that intergenerational work and why it's so important. And I'd say, you know, if I were keeping points or something, there was a lot more hope articulated than than sort of positions of doom. But that even in that reflection, in the safeness of that community, talking about hearing this again and again, represented a kind of wedge that for me sounded very hopeful, right? Like that, the fact that you could bring it up and say, like, you know, we have these, partly what makes our community what it is the ethos that judges certain kinds of language over others, right? That's how we define our relationship to the world, but also the possibility of sort of, you know, having a very like subtle understanding and bringing people in despite perhaps them not, you know, abiding exactly by what we think is the right way to do things is also what defines the community. And I think all of that was heard in that really rich screening and post-screening discussion from which that clip came. So yeah, so for me, even the most pessimistic part of it sounded really hopeful in a lot of ways, because it was sounding that, you know, the safeness of being able to say that, and also sort of some of the positionalities that were sometimes quite judgmental, you know, that defined the community at particular moments in relation to the rest of the world. Don't forget, like, other communities, right? So it's not, you know, so there was a lot at stake, like, in those things. And that's that, you know, when there's a lot at stake, then there's a lot of hope, I think, you know. That's sort of what I was hearing. Okay, I'm going to, I'll share the last thing that I wanted to show, or the thing that I prepared. It's quite little, and it's two things. And I think it goes back to my opening remarks, and it's more presented from the position of someone who's about to enter an archive, say. So it's the hopefulness of the researcher, perhaps embarking upon discovering things in an archive. And as you know, with Spokenweb, we are developing collections that are held in university special collections and archives, but also increasingly we have these community collections that are being brought to us by people who organized and documented events and things in the past, and have been holding on to those things, not knowing what to do with them. So this relates to one of those kinds of collections. And I'm going to share first just an image. And this is the image. Let's see if I can get it up here. And so this is my object of hope. Let me see if I can share it. No, that's not what I want to share. Sorry. There we go. So this is, you know, so you might find this in an archive, right? It's like a tape. And so for me, there's a lot of hope in this artifact. There's a lot of potential. I have a lot of expectations about what I might find there. They might have to do with the actual quality of the recording. It might have to do with the nature of the content. And the names on this, you know, raise a lot of expectations about what I might find there, including sort of Bill Bissett and Ian Stevens. And so this is a tape, one of many tapes that were just sent to me by this person here, Lee Gotham, who started up a spoken word series in Montreal in the mid-90s, and he called it Enough Said, and he had documented all of those events, right? And then he sent us the tapes, and they hadn't been digitized. They had been transferred from other videotapes to these VHS tapes, so it was recorded on a different video medium even prior to this one, and I'm filled with hope still, because I haven't looked at it all, but I have like all these expectations about what this collection is going to mean in relation to understanding the spoken word scene in Montreal in the mid-90s and its emergence. And there are a lot of young artists and interesting artists who I know went on to do a lot of really cool things sort of in this collection. And I thought I'd play a clip from this collection of the very first event, in which Lee Gotham sort of, you know, he uses the word hope, and he talks about, in a way, what he imagines this series may be. So if you can imagine starting a new series, you don't know how it's going to go. You don't know if it's going to go past the first event that you're organizing. People have to show up, perhaps, for it to happen. And he's sort of like in that state of mind. But also what he reads as the first performance piece in this series is really quite apropos, I'd say. So I'm going to, yeah, I'll just end with this quite short clip. And I'll sort of narrate a little bit as I show it as well. And so this clip is, and this is a video, so it's I guess it's different in that sense. This is an audiovisual material. So can you all see that? It's just black right now, right? Now, this is giving me hope. Oh, okay, there's a signal. There's something coming up. That's cool. I wonder what's going to be on this. I have a lot of expectations. Oh, they have a name for it. So they had an idea of what this represents. The exclamation point.
I think I'm going to introduce my friends a little bit later, after we've gotten better acquainted, because this is very much an inspirational, improvisational, we're getting together for the first time this evening. Anyway, we're all together with you for the first time as well, so I hope you enjoy it as much as we will. Yeah, anyway. Attention, project proposals, explorations grants competition, Canada Arts Council. A highly self-conscious spoken word project for voice, guitar, and percussion. For recording, broadcast, and performance. For the hell of it, Montreal, 1994.
All right, that's all I really wanted to show of that. So it just captures all of the hopefulness of starting a new series as I'm hopefully, embarking upon learning about this archive. And then of course he begins, with a kind of parody of a Canada Council application, which are our probably most common expressions of hope in Canada in the arts community, right? Where we're hoping we get the money to do what we want to do sometimes, but also articulating all these possibilities and expectations. So it seemed really appropriate as a first statement in an archive for a series of events that did run for a few years and for which we now have many hours of video documentation.
Thank you for sharing that, Jason. It also makes me think about when hearing him literally say the word hope, that in anticipation of this session, I did search Spokenweb's metadata repository of Swallow for the word hope. I did find some instances of hope in the archive, but I think that the clips that we shared today were much more resonant and complex soundings of hope than anything we could have found that way. So thank you, Jason, for that final clip. Thank you all. We could just let's dig into a few of these comments and then we could wrap things up. But, yeah, the language of the language of the grant. Also, Magdalena, thank you for sharing that line about digging in the archive as a symbol of hope. Yes.
Yeah, your comment, Katherine. I hope, Lee Gotham's statement. I hope you enjoy this as much as we will. So they know they're going to enjoy what they're doing. It doesn't matter. So that sort of stance, it's good that we have an audience, but we're going to do this anyways, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and maybe in that spirit too, we hope that future listeners and watchers of this video will enjoy it because it will be posted on the Blue Met Festival site. And we hope that you all here enjoyed talking about hope in the archives, and maybe enjoy is more, it's more than that, because as was said before, when talking about hope, there's a lot at stake, and that I think that today, we're laughing here at the end, but really our conversation was very serious, and hope is not just a silver lining. It's something that deeply informs what we do. So thank you all, and I hope in the most serious and also in the spirit of many directions and the micro encounters that we will take something away from this and put it into action.